Deep in the remote wilderness of Northern California, where ancient redwoods cast shadows older than civilization itself, the Cahto people have lived and hunted for thousands of years. They know every creek, every hidden trail, every dangerous cliff that could claim a life in seconds. But on a crisp autumn morning in 1952, when 23-year-old Joseph Littlefield heard his younger brother's terrified scream echoing from the depths of Bear Canyon, he discovered that even the most experienced hunters can face the unimaginable. What started as a routine deer hunt would become a desperate race against time, a test of courage that would reveal not just the power of family bonds, but also an incredible discovery that would change their understanding of their ancestral lands forever. Some stories are told around campfires for generations. This is one of them. The canyon held secrets that morning, secrets that would challenge everything Joseph thought he knew, about survival, about family, and about the thin line between life and death in the unforgiving wilderness of California's Lost Coast. The first light of dawn crept through the towering redwoods like fingers of gold, painting the forest floor in patches of amber and shadow. Joseph Littlefield moved silently through the undergrowth, his moccasined feet finding purchase on the damp earth with the practiced ease of someone born to these mountains. At 23, he possessed the quiet confidence of a man who had learned the ways of the wilderness from his grandfather's stories and his father's patient teachings. Behind him, his 16-year-old brother Tommy crashed through the brush with all the subtlety of a young bear, snapping twigs and rustling leaves despite Joseph's repeated lessons about moving like water through the forest. Joseph smiled to himself, remembering his own eager clumsiness at that age. Their father, William Littlefield, had been endlessly patient with both boys, teaching them that hunting was not just about bringing home meat for the family, but about understanding their place in the great circle of life that connected all living things. The October air carried the sharp scent of approaching winter, mixed with the rich earthiness of decomposing leaves and the distant smell of the Pacific Ocean, still 20 miles to the west. Joseph paused at a familiar oak tree, its trunk scarred by generations of deer rubbing their antlers against its bark. He ran his fingers along the rough grooves, feeling the stories written in wood and time. Tommy stumbled up behind him, breathing hard and fumbling with his grandfather's old rifle, a weathered Winchester that had fed the Littlefield family for decades. The boy's excitement was palpable, radiating from him like heat from a fire. This was only his third hunting trip without their father's supervision, and Joseph could feel the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar blanket. "You need to slow down," Joseph whispered, his voice barely audible even in the morning stillness. "The deer hear you coming from a mile away." Tommy flushed red beneath his bronzed skin, embarrassed but eager to learn. "Sorry, Joseph, I'm just excited. Papa said if we bring back a good buck today, Mama will make her special venison stew for the harvest celebration." Joseph nodded, remembering the rich, savory smell of their mother's cooking that could draw the entire extended family to their small wooden house nestled in the hills above the Eel River. Maria Littlefield had a gift for turning the simplest ingredients into feasts that lasted in memory long after the last bite was finished. Her stew was legendary among the scattered Cahto families who still maintained the old ways while adapting to the changing world around them. The brothers had left their house before sunrise, following a deer trail that Joseph had scouted earlier in the week. Fresh tracks in the mud near the creek told him that a small herd had been moving through this area regularly, probably heading down to the water at dawn before settling into the thick brush for the day. If they positioned themselves correctly near the natural funnel where the trail narrowed between two steep ridges, they might have a chance at a clean shot. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the trees began to thin slightly, replaced by dense manzanita and chinkapin that formed nearly impenetrable walls of vegetation. Joseph knew these mountains like the lines on his own hands, every hidden spring and secret meadow mapped in his memory from years of exploration. His grandfather had taught him to read the land like a book, to understand the stories told by animal tracks, broken branches, and the subtle signs that most people walked past without noticing. "Tell me again about the canyon," Tommy said as they paused to rest beside a small stream, its water running clear and cold over smooth river stones. Joseph looked toward the west, where the ground fell away sharply into what the locals called Bear Canyon, a deep slash in the earth that dropped nearly 300 feet to a rocky bottom. The canyon had been carved by countless years of winter floods, its walls steep and treacherous, lined with loose rock and stubborn brush that clung to life in impossible places. "Grandfather used to say that canyon was where the earth spirits went to dream," Joseph said, cupping his hands to drink from the stream. "The old ones avoided it except for special ceremonies, too dangerous for everyday hunting." "But you've been down there," Tommy pressed, his eyes bright with curiosity. Joseph had indeed descended into Bear Canyon, but only once. and that experience had left him with a healthy respect for its hidden dangers. 2 years ago, following an injured deer that had managed to escape after a poor shot, he had rappelled down the canyon wall using a rope made from twisted hide. What he had found at the bottom was a different world, cut off from sunlight by the towering walls, filled with strange echoes and an almost supernatural quiet. The deer had died near a small pool fed by a waterfall that dropped from the canyon rim like a silver ribbon. But as Joseph had approached the animal, he had noticed something else. Markings on the canyon wall that didn't look natural, almost like symbols carved into the rock face by human hands. He had spent hours examining the strange marks, but the failing light and the difficulty of the climb back to the rim had forced him to leave without fully exploring. "I went down once," Joseph admitted, "but it's not a place to hunt casually. The walls are too steep, and if someone got hurt down there, it would be almost impossible to get them out." Tommy nodded solemnly, but Joseph could see the adventure-hungry gleam in his brother's eyes that reminded him so much of himself at that age. The young man was fearless to a fault, always eager to test himself against the wilderness, always pushing boundaries that their elders had established. For good reasons, they resumed their climb, following the deer trail as it wound between massive boulders left behind by some ancient geological upheaval. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the dew and warming the air enough that Joseph began to feel sweat beading on his forehead. He estimated they had about 2 hours before the deer would settle into their midday rest, hidden in the cool shadows of the deep brush, where hunting became nearly impossible. As they approached the spot Joseph had chosen for their ambush, he held up a hand to signal Tommy to stop. Ahead of them, the trail curved around a large granite outcropping before disappearing into a narrow passage between two ridges. This was perfect hunting territory. The deer would have to pass through this natural bottleneck, and the rocks would provide excellent concealment for the hunters. Joseph motioned for Tommy to take position behind a cluster of large stones on the left side of the trail, while he moved to a similar hiding spot on the right. From these positions, they could cover the entire passage, ensuring that any deer trying to escape would have to run directly away from them, presenting a clear shot for whichever brother had the better angle. As they settled into position, Joseph felt the familiar mixture of excitement and calm that always came with hunting. This was meditation in action, a state of heightened awareness where every sense became sharper. Every small sound and movement registered with crystal clarity. He could hear Tommy's breathing gradually slowing as the boy learned to control his excitement, becoming part of the landscape rather than an intrusion upon it. The minutes passed slowly, marked only by the distant call of a jay and the whisper of wind through the pine needles overhead. Joseph found his mind wandering to the strange markings he had seen in Bear Canyon, wondering again if they could have been made by his ancestors, perhaps during vision quests or coming-of-age ceremonies that had been lost to time and the disruption of the reservation years. A soft sound brought his attention, snapping back to the present. Hooves on rock, moving carefully but steadily up the trail toward their position. Joseph's pulse quickened as he eased his rifle into position, checking that the safety was off while keeping the barrel pointed safely away from Tommy's location. The first deer appeared around the granite outcropping, a young doe stepping delicately, her head raised and alert. Behind her came 2 more does and a yearling, all moving with the cautious grace of wild creatures who understood that danger could come from any direction. Joseph waited, knowing that where there were does, a buck might follow, bringing up the rear of the small herd and watching for threats from behind. His patience was rewarded when a magnificent 4-point buck emerged from behind the rocks, his antlers catching the morning sunlight like polished bone. The animal was perfect, young and healthy, with enough meat to feed the family for weeks when properly prepared and preserved. Joseph raised his rifle slowly, taking careful aim while controlling his breathing the way his father had taught him. But just as his finger began to tighten on the trigger, the buck's head snapped up, ears forward and nostrils flaring. Something had spooked him. Some sound or scent that human senses couldn't detect. The entire herd froze for a moment that seemed to last forever, then exploded into motion, bounding away through the brush with the fluid power that made deer seem like spirits rather than flesh and blood. Joseph lowered his rifle, disappointed but not surprised. Hunting required patience, and missed opportunities were part of the experience. He was about to signal Tommy that they should wait to see if more deer would come along the trail when he heard his brother's sharp intake of breath. Looking across the clearing, Joseph saw Tommy pointing toward the western edge of the ridge, his face pale beneath his tan. Following his brother's gaze, Joseph felt his own blood run cold. There, teetering on the very edge of Bear Canyon, was their mother. Maria Littlefield stood like a statue against the morning sky, her long black hair whipping in the wind that rose from the canyon depths. Even from a distance, Joseph could see that something was wrong. His mother's posture was rigid, unnatural, as if she were fighting against some invisible force. Her arms were raised slightly from her sides, and she swayed back and forth like a tree in a storm. "Mama!" Tommy shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he scrambled up from behind his hiding place. The sound of his brother's cry galvanized Joseph into action. He dropped his rifle and sprinted toward the canyon edge, his heart pounding with a terror he had never experienced before. As he ran, 1,000 questions raced through his mind. What was his mother doing here? She never hunted, rarely ventured far from home without their father. How had she gotten to this remote location? And why was she standing so dangerously close to the canyon rim? As he drew closer, Joseph could see that his mother's eyes were closed, her face peaceful in a way that terrified him more than any expression of fear or pain. She looked like someone walking in a dream, unaware of the 300-foot drop that waited just inches from her feet. "Mama, don't move." Joseph called out, trying to keep his voice calm and steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. "Stay exactly where you are." But Maria Littlefield didn't respond to her son's voice. Instead, she took another small step forward, closer to the edge, and Joseph realized with growing horror that she wasn't just standing near the canyon. She was sleepwalking toward it. Behind him, he could hear Tommy crashing through the brush, sobbing with fear and calling their mother's name. But Joseph forced himself to focus on the immediate problem. If he could reach his mother before she took that final, fatal step, he might be able to grab her and pull her back to safety. But if he startled her, if his sudden appearance shocked her awake at the wrong moment, she might stumble forward into the abyss. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of rushing water from far below and the sharp scent of stone and earth. Joseph slowed his approach, moving with the same careful stealth he used when stalking deer, every step calculated to avoid breaking a twig or dislodging a loose stone. But as he drew within arm's reach of his mother, the unthinkable happened. A loose piece of shale shifted under Maria's foot, and she stumbled forward, her eyes flying open just in time to see the empty air yawning before her. Joseph lunged forward with every ounce of strength and speed he possessed, his hand stretching toward his mother's arm as she began to fall. For a moment that lasted an eternity, he felt his fingers brush against the fabric of her dress, felt the possibility of salvation slip through his grasp like water. Then Maria Littlefield disappeared over the edge of Bear Canyon, her scream echoing off the stone walls as she plummeted toward the rocky bottom far below. Joseph threw himself flat on the canyon rim, peering down into the shadowy depths where his mother had vanished. The walls were nearly vertical, dropping away into darkness broken only by the thin line of the stream that wandered across the canyon floor. Somewhere down there, in that maze of stone and shadow, his mother was lying broken and alone, if she was still alive at all. Tommy reached the edge and collapsed beside his brother, tears streaming down his face as he stared into the abyss that had swallowed their mother. "Is she—" he began, but couldn't finish the question. Joseph's mind raced as he tried to assess the situation. The nearest help was their father, probably working in the fields near their house, but that was hours away even if Tommy ran the entire distance. By the time they could organize a rescue party and bring ropes and equipment to the canyon, it might be too late. But there was another option, one that would require every skill Joseph had learned in his 23 years of life in these mountains. He had descended into Bear Canyon once before and emerged alive. He knew it could be done, even without proper equipment, even under the worst possible circumstances. "Tommy, listen to me," Joseph said, his voice steady despite the chaos of emotions raging in his chest. "I need you to run home and get Papa. Tell him what happened and have him bring every rope we own. Can you do that?" Tommy nodded, wiping his nose on his sleeve and struggling to control his sobbing. "But what about you? You can't go down there alone." Joseph was already moving, gathering the coiled rope he always carried for emergencies, checking the knots and testing the strength of the braided hide. "I'm going down to find Mama. She might be hurt but alive, and if she is, every minute counts." As Tommy disappeared into the forest, running toward home with the desperate speed of a young man trying to outrun disaster, Joseph began the careful process of securing his rope to the sturdiest tree near the canyon edge. The ancient oak had probably stood on this spot for centuries, its roots running deep into the rocky soil, its trunk thick enough to anchor a dozen men. He tested the rope one final time, said a quick prayer to whatever spirits watched over foolish sons attempting impossible rescues, and began his descent into Bear Canyon. As the rim of the canyon rose above him and the walls closed in on both sides, Joseph couldn't shake the feeling that he was descending into a place where the normal rules of the world no longer applied. The rope creaked ominously against the canyon wall, and loose stones scattered away beneath his feet, falling into the darkness below with the sound of distant thunder. Somewhere in that darkness his mother was waiting, and Joseph Littlefield would move heaven and earth to reach her, even if it meant risking his own life in the attempt. The descent had begun, and there would be no turning back until he found his mother, alive or dead, at the bottom of Bear Canyon. The rope burned against Joseph's palms as he lowered himself hand over hand down the canyon wall, his feet searching for purchase on the loose rock face. 20 feet down, then 30, and still the bottom seemed impossibly far below. The walls of Bear Canyon rose around him like the ribs of some ancient beast, blocking out most of the morning sunlight and creating a twilight world, where shadows played tricks on the eyes. Each movement required careful calculation. One wrong step could send loose shale cascading down the cliff face, or worse, could snap the rope that represented his only connection to the world above. Joseph had made this descent once before, but that had been under controlled conditions, with proper equipment and no desperate urgency driving him forward. Now, with his mother's life hanging in the balance, every second felt both precious and eternal. The sound of rushing water grew louder as he descended, echoing off the canyon walls in a way that made it impossible to determine exactly where the stream was located. Joseph remembered from his previous exploration that the creek wound back and forth across the canyon floor, sometimes disappearing underground only to emerge again from hidden springs. The water was one of the things that made Bear Canyon so treacherous. The rocks near the stream were often slick with moss and spray, creating natural slip hazards that could send an unwary traveler tumbling into the rushing current. 40 feet down, Joseph's feet finally found a narrow ledge that ran along the canyon wall for perhaps 10 yards, before disappearing around a bend in the rock face. He rested there for a moment, catching his breath and studying the terrain below. The bottom was still a long way down, but he could see it now, a jumbled collection of house-sized boulders that had fallen from the canyon walls over the centuries, creating a maze of stone passages and hidden pools. And there, crumpled against a large boulder near the stream, was a splash of color that made Joseph's heart leap with equal parts hope and terror. The blue fabric of his mother's favorite dress, the one she had been wearing when she left the house that morning to gather herbs near the creek. From this distance, he couldn't tell if she was moving, couldn't even be certain it was actually his mother and not just shadows playing tricks on his desperate eyes.
"Mom,"
he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. "Mama, can you hear me?" No response came back, except the endless whisper of water over stone and the faint rustle of wind through the sparse vegetation that clung to the canyon walls. Joseph resumed his descent, moving faster now that he had a target, pushing his luck with the rope and the unstable rock face in his eagerness to reach the bottom. The remaining 50 feet passed in a blur of controlled falling and desperate scrambling. When his feet finally touched solid ground, Joseph felt a moment of dizzy relief that was immediately replaced by the urgency of finding his mother. He untied himself from the rope but left it hanging against the canyon wall, knowing he would need it for the return journey, assuming he survived long enough to make one. The floor of Bear Canyon was a wonderland of geological chaos, filled with formations that looked like the work of giant sculptors. Water had carved smooth channels through solid stone, creating natural bridges and tunnels that defied explanation. But Joseph had no time to appreciate the strange beauty of the place. He picked his way carefully over the uneven ground, heading toward the spot where he had seen the blue fabric. As he drew closer, his worst fears were confirmed. Maria Littlefield lay motionless against a boulder the size of a small house, her body twisted at angles that suggested serious injury. But even from 20 feet away, Joseph could see the gentle rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, unconscious but breathing, and that knowledge sent a surge of hope through his exhausted body. "Mama," he whispered as he knelt beside her, afraid to move her but desperate to assess her injuries. "I'm here. Tommy's gone to get Papa. You're going to be all right." Maria's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. When they finally settled on her son's face, Joseph saw recognition dawn slowly, followed by pain and bewilderment. "Joseph?" Her voice was barely audible above the sound of the stream. Where are we? How did I get here?" Joseph felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air in the canyon depths. His mother had no memory of walking to the canyon edge, no recollection of the sleepwalking episode that had nearly killed her. As gently as possible, he explained what had happened, while examining her for obvious injuries. Her left arm was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle that made Joseph wince in sympathy. There were cuts and bruises covering her face and hands, and when he carefully checked her legs, she cried out in pain as he touched her right ankle. But considering the distance she had fallen, the injuries seemed almost miraculously minor. The boulder had obviously broken her fall, and the deep sand that had accumulated around its base had cushioned her impact. "I don't understand," Maria said, struggling to sit up despite Joseph's gentle efforts to keep her still. "I remember going to gather medicine plants near the creek behind our house.
The next thing I know, I'm here at the bottom of Bear Canyon with you hovering over me like a worried mother hen."
Joseph helped her lean back against the boulder, arranging his jacket under her head as a pillow.
"You were sleepwalking, Mama. Tommy and I were hunting up on the ridge when we saw you standing at the canyon edge. I tried to reach you, but I fell." Maria closed her eyes, absorbing the reality of her situation. "How badly am I hurt? Your arm is broken, and your ankle might be sprained or worse. But you're alive, and that's what matters. Papa will be here soon with help and proper ropes. We'll get you out of here." Maria nodded, but Joseph could see the worry in her eyes. She understood as well as he did that rescuing an injured person from the bottom of Bear Canyon would require more than just rope and determination. They would need a proper rescue team, probably equipment that would have to be brought from the county seat, and coordination that could take hours or even days to organize. "Tell me about this place," Maria said, obviously trying to distract herself from the pain and the gravity of their situation. "You've been here before." Joseph looked around at the strange formations surrounding them, remembering his previous exploration and the mysterious markings he had discovered. 2 years ago, I followed a wounded deer down here. It's like another world, completely cut off from everything above. See those rock formations over there?" He pointed to a series of natural arches that spanned the stream, creating a series of stone bridges that looked almost too perfect to be natural. The water flowed beneath them in a series of small waterfalls, each pool connected to the next by channels worn smooth by countless years of erosion. "It's beautiful," Maria said, genuine wonder in her voice despite her pain. "Like a cathedral made of stone," Joseph nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. There was something almost sacred about the canyon floor, a sense of ancient peace that seemed at odds with the violent forces that had created it. But as beautiful as it was, Bear Canyon was also a trap. The walls were too steep and unstable for an untrained climber, and the few natural paths that might lead to the rim were blocked by fallen rocks or impossible terrain. As they waited for help to arrive, Joseph made Maria as comfortable as possible and began to explore their immediate surroundings more thoroughly. If they were going to be stuck in the canyon for any length of time, he needed to find fresh water, shelter, and anything else that might help them survive. The stream provided plenty of clean, cold water, and Joseph found several spots where the current had carved deep pools that would be perfect for fishing if necessary. But it was while he was examining one of these pools that he made a discovery that changed everything. Carved into the rock face just above the waterline were the same strange symbols he had noticed during his previous visit to the canyon. But now, seeing them in better light and from a different angle, Joseph realized they weren't just random markings. They formed patterns, sequences that looked almost like writing or some form of ancient record-keeping. "Mama, you need to see this,"
He called, helping Maria hobble over to the pool where the symbols were most clearly visible.
Maria studied the markings with the intensity of someone who had grown up hearing the old stories from her grandmother, tales of the time before the white settlers arrived and the traditional ways were still strong. After several minutes of examination, her face grew pale with excitement and recognition. "Joseph, these aren't just decorations or idle scratches," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "These are record stones, the kind the old ones used to mark sacred places and important events. My grandmother told me about them, but I never thought I'd actually see any." Joseph felt a chill of recognition as his mother's words triggered memories of his grandfather's stories. The old man had spoken of hidden places where the ancestors had left messages for future generations, locations known only to the shamans and clan leaders who had guarded their secrets with their lives. "What do they say?" Joseph asked, studying the symbols with new respect. Maria traced the markings with her finger, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I can only read a few of them. This one means sacred water, and this one is place of visions. But there are others that are completely unknown to me. We would need an elder, someone who still remembers the old writing, to translate them properly." As they studied the mysterious symbols, Joseph became aware of a strange sensation, almost like being watched. He turned slowly, scanning the canyon walls and the shadowy recesses between the boulders, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling persisted, and he found himself remembering his grandfather's warnings about places where the spirits gathered, locations that existed in the space between the everyday world and the realm of dreams and visions. "Do you feel it too?" Maria asked quietly, and Joseph realized that she had noticed his unease. "Feel what?" "Like we're not alone down here, like there are eyes watching us from the shadows." Joseph nodded, grateful that he wasn't the only one experiencing the strange sensation. Grandfather always said that some places hold memories, that the spirits of the ancestors sometimes linger in locations that were important to them. "Maybe that's why I came here," Maria said thoughtfully. "Maybe the sleepwalking wasn't random. Maybe something was calling me to this place." Before Joseph could respond to his mother's unsettling suggestion, a new sound echoed through the canyon, the distant shout of human voices coming from somewhere high above. Tommy had made it home and returned with their father and help. Joseph felt a surge of relief that was immediately tempered by the realization that getting his injured mother out of the canyon was going to be far more complicated than getting down had been. He helped Maria back to the spot where she had fallen, making her as comfortable as possible while they waited for the rescue to begin. But as he looked up at the thin strip of sky visible between the canyon walls, Joseph couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal in Bear Canyon was far from over. Something about this place felt unfinished, as if their presence here was part of some larger pattern that had been set in motion long before they were born. The ancient symbols seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond his understanding, and the sensation of being watched had only grown stronger as the afternoon wore on. Whatever secrets Bear Canyon was hiding, Joseph suspected that he and his mother had stumbled into something far more significant than a simple hunting accident. The question was whether they would survive long enough to uncover the truth about this mysterious place and the forces that had drawn them into its depths. The voices from above grew clearer as the afternoon progressed, echoing off the canyon walls in a way that made them sound sometimes near, sometimes impossibly distant. Joseph could make out his father's deep baritone calling instructions to someone, probably Tommy, and the higher voices of at least two other men. Word had spread quickly through the small Cahto community, and neighbors had dropped their own work to join the rescue effort. "Joseph!" His father's voice boomed down into the canyon. "Are you both all right down there?" Joseph cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted back, "Mama's hurt but alive! Broken arm and injured ankle. We need ropes and medical supplies." The response took several minutes to come back, and when it did, Joseph could hear the worry and determination in William Littlefield's voice. "We're organizing a proper rescue. Dr. Henderson is coming from town with medical equipment. Hold tight down there." Dr. Samuel Henderson was the only physician within 50 miles who had any experience with wilderness rescue, having served as an army medic during the war before settling in the small logging town of Laytonville. If anyone could figure out how to get an injured woman out of Bear Canyon safely, it would be him. But as the afternoon shadows grew longer, Joseph began to understand the magnitude of the challenge facing the rescue team. The canyon walls were not only steep and unstable, they were also much higher than they appeared from above. What looked like a difficult but manageable descent from the rim was revealed from below to be a nearly vertical drop, interrupted by only a few narrow ledges and outcroppings. Maria was growing weaker as the day wore on, the shock of her injuries and the cold air in the canyon depths sapping her strength. Joseph had done what he could to make her comfortable, building a small fire with deadwood he found scattered around the boulder field, and fashioning a crude splint for her broken arm, using branches and strips torn from his shirt. But he knew she needed proper medical attention, and soon. "Tell me more about the symbols," Joseph said, trying to keep his mother alert and engaged while they waited for help. "What else do you remember from your grandmother's stories?" Maria's eyes focused on the mysterious markings carved into the rock face, and some of the pain seemed to leave her features as she immersed herself in memories of the old woman who had raised her after her own parents died in the influenza epidemic of 1918. "Grandmother used to say that the ancestors left messages for future generations in special places," Maria said slowly, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. She called them stone libraries, places where important knowledge was preserved for times when it would be needed most. Joseph studied the symbols with renewed interest. If his great-grandmother had been right, then the markings on the canyon wall might contain information that could help them understand not just their current predicament, but perhaps something much larger about their family's connection to this place. She said that some people were born with the gift of reading the stone writing, Maria continued. Usually women, often the daughters of shamans or healers. They were called the keepers of memory, and they were responsible for maintaining the sacred sites and interpreting the messages left by previous generations. As his mother spoke, Joseph felt a strange tingling sensation in his fingertips, almost as if the stone symbols were generating some kind of energy. He reached out tentatively to touch one of the larger markings, and the moment his skin made contact with the ancient carving, the world around him seemed to shift and blur. For just an instant, Bear Canyon was transformed. Instead of the empty, shadowy space he knew, Joseph saw the canyon floor filled with people, men, women, and children dressed in traditional clothing, moving purposefully between carefully constructed shelters built into the natural alcoves in the canyon walls. Cooking fires sent thin streams of smoke rising toward the rim, and the sound of voices and laughter echoed off the stone surfaces. But more startling than the vision itself was the sudden, overwhelming sense of recognition that flooded through him. Joseph knew this place, not from memory but from something deeper, as if the knowledge had been passed down through his bloodline like the color of his eyes or the shape of his hands. "Joseph!" His mother's sharp call snapped him back to the present. "What just happened? You looked like you were seeing a ghost." Joseph stared at his hand, still tingling from contact with the carved stone. "I think I might have been," he said slowly. "Mama, what if these symbols aren't just historical records? What if there's something more?" Before Maria could respond, a new commotion from above caught their attention. Ropes were being lowered into the canyon, not just Joseph's original line, but several others, thick climbing ropes that could support the weight of rescue equipment and injured people. And attached to the end of one rope was a large canvas bag that probably contained medical supplies and other emergency gear. Dr. Henderson's voice called down to them, crisp and professional despite the obvious difficulty of the situation. "Mrs. Littlefield, can you hear me? I'm coming down to examine your injuries." Within minutes, a tall, lean man in his 40s was rappelling down the canyon wall with the practiced ease of someone who had made similar descents before. Dr. Henderson had served with mountain rescue units during the war, and his confidence on the ropes was reassuring to both Joseph and his mother. "Well, this is certainly an interesting house call," Dr. Henderson said as his feet touched the canyon floor. He quickly untied himself from his descent rope and moved to where Maria was lying against the boulder. "Let's have a look at those injuries." The examination was thorough and professional. "Doctor." Henderson confirmed Joseph's assessment that Maria's arm was broken, but he was pleased to discover that the fracture was clean and should heal properly with adequate immobilization. The ankle injury was more serious, a severe sprain with possible ligament damage that would require weeks of rest and careful treatment. "The good news is that nothing appears to be life-threatening," Dr. Henderson announced after completing his examination. "The bad news is that getting you out of here is going to be quite a project. These canyon walls are about as challenging as anything I've encountered." As the doctor worked to properly splint Maria's arm and ankle, Joseph found his attention drawn back to the ancient symbols on the canyon wall. In the late afternoon light, they seemed almost to glow with their own inner luminescence, and the strange tingling sensation in his fingertips had not completely faded. "Dr. Henderson," Joseph said suddenly, "have you ever seen markings like these before?" The physician glanced up from his work to study the carved symbols. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to intense interest as he took in the intricate patterns and the obvious age of the carvings. "My God," he said quietly. "I've heard about these but never actually seen them. During the war, I served with a Navajo code talker who told me about similar markings in the Southwest. He said they were created by his ancestors to mark sacred sites and record important tribal knowledge." Dr. Henderson stood and moved closer to the symbols, running his fingers over the carved lines with the same reverence that Joseph had felt. "He told me that some of the markings were like guidebooks for vision quests, describing specific locations where young people went to seek spiritual guidance and connect with their ancestors." The implications of the doctor's words hit Joseph like a physical blow. If Bear Canyon had been used as a vision quest site by his ancestors, then his mother's sleepwalking episode might not have been random at all. Perhaps some deep inherited instinct had drawn her to this place, responding to a call that her conscious mind couldn't understand, but her spirit recognized. "There's something else, Dr. Caleb," Henderson continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "My Navajo friend told me that some of the sacred sites were still active, still capable of inducing visions and spiritual experiences in people who had the proper bloodline or spiritual preparation. He said the ancestors built these places as bridges between the physical world and the spirit realm." As if summoned by the doctor's words, the sensation of being watched suddenly intensified. Joseph felt the hair on the back of his neck rise as he became aware of movement in the shadows between the boulders, shapes that seemed to shift and flow like smoke when he tried to look directly at them. Do you see them too? Maria asked softly, and Joseph realized that she was staring at the same shadowy figures that had caught his attention. Dr. Henderson followed their gaze, his scientific training warring with what his senses were telling him. I see something, he admitted reluctantly. Probably just tricks of light and shadow. But there's definitely something unusual about the atmosphere down here. Before anyone could comment further on the strange phenomena, a new development from above demanded their attention. William Littlefield's voice echoed down into the canyon, but this time he wasn't calling to his family. He was shouting orders to someone else, his words urgent and concerned. What's happening up there? Doctor? Henderson called out. The response sent a chill through all three people at the bottom of the canyon. Storm coming in fast from the west. William's voice carried a note of genuine alarm. Heavy rain and high winds. We need to get you out of there now. Joseph looked up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the canyon walls and felt his heart sink. Dark clouds were indeed building on the western horizon, and he could already hear the distant rumble of thunder. A heavy rainstorm in the mountains above Bear Canyon would mean flash flooding in the canyon itself, turning the peaceful stream into a raging torrent that could sweep away everything in its path. How long do we have? Dr. Dagan? Henderson shouted up to the rescue team. Maybe an hour, came the grim response. The radio says it's a big one, moving fast. Dr. Henderson turned to Joseph and Maria, his expression grave but determined. Getting your mother up those walls was going to be difficult under ideal conditions. In a storm, with limited visibility and wet ropes, it becomes extremely dangerous. But leaving her down here during a flash flood isn't an option either. Joseph felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. Every option seemed to carry unacceptable risks. Every decision could lead to disaster. But as he struggled with the growing sense of desperation, his eyes fell once again on the ancient symbols carved into the canyon wall. Suddenly, one of the markings seemed to stand out from the others, pulsing with the same strange energy he had felt when he first touched the stone carvings. Without fully understanding why, Joseph found himself moving toward that particular symbol, his hand reaching out to trace its intricate lines. The moment his fingers made contact with the carved stone, the world around him exploded into vision and memory, and Joseph Littlefield found himself standing in Bear Canyon as it had existed centuries before his birth, surrounded by the spirits of his ancestors who had gathered to share their wisdom with a descendant who desperately needed their help. The storm was coming, but Joseph was no longer afraid. The ancestors had survived in this canyon for generations, and they were about to show him secrets that could save his family's life. The vision hit Joseph like diving into a mountain lake, a shock that penetrated every fiber of his being and transported him completely out of his own time and place. One moment he was standing in Bear Canyon watching storm clouds gather overhead, and the next he was experiencing the canyon as it had existed perhaps 200 years before his birth. The transformation was absolute and breathtaking. Where before there had been empty space and scattered boulders, Joseph now saw a thriving community built into the natural alcoves and protected spaces of the canyon walls. Carefully constructed shelters made from woven branches and hide blended seamlessly with the stone formations, creating homes that seemed to grow organically from the canyon itself. But more incredible than the physical changes was the presence of the people. Dozens of men, women, and children moved through the canyon with purpose and quiet efficiency, going about their daily tasks with the confidence of people who belonged completely to their environment. They wore traditional clothing that Joseph recognized from his grandfather's descriptions, buckskin decorated with shells and intricate beadwork, baskets woven from plant fibers in patterns that told stories, tools crafted from stone and bone with a perfection that could only come from generations of refinement. And they could see him. An elderly woman approached Joseph with the measured gait of someone who commanded great respect within the community. Her hair was completely white and braided with small bones and stones that clicked softly as she moved. But it was her eyes that held Joseph's attention, dark, ancient, filled with a wisdom that seemed to encompass centuries of knowledge and experience. "You have come at last," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the fact that she spoke in the old language that Joseph somehow understood perfectly. "We have been waiting for you, Joseph Littlefield, son of William, grandson of Thomas, great-grandson of Little Bear, who was my own daughter." The revelation that this ancient woman was his own ancestor should have shocked Joseph, but in the timeless space of the vision, it seemed as natural as breathing. He was standing in Bear Canyon not just as it had been, but as it always was in the realm beyond ordinary time, where past and present and future existed simultaneously. "Your mother was called here," the old woman continued, "but not for the reasons you think. Maria carries the gift of the Keepers of Memory, passed down through the maternal line but dormant until awakened by Mead. The stones called to her spirit because the time of hiding is ending, and the knowledge preserved here must be shared once again. Joseph looked around at the bustling community, trying to understand how this vision related to his current desperate situation. Thunder was growing louder overhead, and he could feel the urgency of the approaching storm even within the timeless space of the ancestral memory. "I don't understand," he said. "How does this help us get out of the canyon before the flood comes?" The old woman smiled with infinite patience. "You think in the way of the modern world, where problems have only one solution and time moves in only one direction. But this canyon exists in sacred space, where the ancestors who lived here still live, where the knowledge they preserved still has power to help their descendants." She led Joseph toward one of the natural alcoves in the canyon wall, where several other figures had gathered around what appeared to be a detailed map carved into the living stone. But as Joseph drew closer, he realized it wasn't a map at all. It was a three-dimensional representation of Bear Canyon itself, showing not just the surface features but also the hidden passages and chambers that honeycombed the canyon walls.
"Your people built escape routes," Joseph breathed, understanding beginning to dawn on him.
"Not escape routes," corrected a younger man who stepped forward from the group. Joseph felt another shock of recognition as he looked into eyes that were identical to his own. This was his great-great-grandfather, the one his family called Little Bear, the man who had first taught the Littlefield children about the old ways before the reservation years scattered the clans. "We built survival routes," Little Bear continued. "This canyon was never just a place to live. It was a fortress, a sanctuary that could shelter our people during the worst storms and the darkest times. The flash floods that terrify you were as common then as now, but we learned to work with the water instead of fighting against it." Little Bear pointed to specific sections of the stone carving that showed a complex network of tunnels and chambers hidden behind what appeared to be solid canyon walls. The water carves new passages every year, but the main channels remain the same. When the floods come, they follow predictable paths, and those who know the secret ways can find safety even in the worst storms. Joseph studied the carved map intently, trying to memorize the locations of the hidden passages. But as he watched, the stone carving began to change, showing not the canyon as it had been, but as it was now, with the accumulated changes of 2 centuries clearly marked. The ancient knowledge was adapting itself to present circumstances, providing information that could actually save his family. "Here," said another ancestor, a woman who looked remarkably like Joseph's mother. "The passage behind the waterfall still exists, though it has been hidden by fallen stones. Move 3 of the larger rocks and you will find an opening large enough for your mother to crawl through. It leads to a chamber 20 feet above the flood level, with an air passage that connects to the surface." "But how will I know where to look?" Joseph asked, feeling the urgency of real time pressing against the edges of his vision. The woman who resembled his mother smiled and reached out to touch his forehead. The moment her fingers made contact with his skin, Joseph felt a download of information that was far more complete than words could ever convey. In an instant, he knew exactly where to find the hidden entrance, how to move the concealing stones, and how to guide his injured mother through the narrow passage to safety. But the vision was not finished with him yet. The old woman who had first spoken to him gestured for his attention once more, her expression growing grave and urgent. "There is something else you must understand," she said. "Your mother's sleepwalking was not random, and this is not the last time the stones will call to your family. The knowledge preserved here is needed in your time, Joseph Littlefield. The old ways are dying, but they must not be lost completely. Your children and your children's children will face challenges that can only be met by combining the wisdom of the ancestors with the tools of the modern world." Joseph felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. "What am I supposed to do? I'm just a hunter, not a shaman, or a keeper of ancient wisdom. You are more than you know," Little Bear said firmly. "The ability to see this vision, to communicate with the ancestors across the barriers of time and death, that is not a gift given to everyone. You have been chosen to bridge the gap between the old world and the new, to ensure that the most important knowledge survives the changes that are coming." Thunder crashed overhead, so loud that it penetrated even into the timeless space of the vision. Joseph could feel the pull of ordinary reality growing stronger, demanding his return to the urgent crisis of the approaching storm. "Go now," the old woman said. "Save your family first, but remember what you have learned here. The stones will call to you again when the time is right, and you must be ready to answer." The vision began to fade around the edges, the ancient community dissolving back into shadows and memory. But as the last of the ancestral figures disappeared, Joseph felt something solid pressed into his hand. A small stone amulet carved with the same symbols that decorated the canyon walls. Then he was back in his own time and place, standing beside his mother and Dr. Henderson as the first heavy raindrops began to fall from the darkening sky above. But the knowledge from his vision remained crystal clear, and Joseph knew exactly what he needed to do to save them all. "Dr. Henderson," he said urgently, "I know where we can take shelter. There's a hidden chamber behind the waterfall, high enough above the creek level to be safe from flooding." The physician looked skeptical, but the rapidly worsening weather left no room for lengthy discussions. "Are you certain? Because once we move your mother, we're committed to whatever plan you have in mind." Joseph looked at the carved stone amulet in his hand, still warm from the touch of his ancestors. "I'm certain," he said with absolute conviction. "Trust me." As they began the careful process of moving Maria toward the waterfall, Joseph couldn't help but marvel at the strange turn his life had taken. He had started the day as a simple hunter looking for deer to feed his family. Now he was carrying forward the wisdom of centuries, chosen by forces he barely understood, to serve as a bridge between ancient knowledge and modern survival. The storm was coming, but Joseph was no longer afraid. The ancestors had shown him the way, and he would not let them down. The rain began in earnest as Joseph and Dr. Henderson carefully carried Maria toward the waterfall, each step calculated to avoid jolting her injured arm and ankle. The droplets that fell into Bear Canyon were cold and heavy, promising the kind of deluge that could transform the peaceful creek into a raging torrent within minutes. Joseph led them around the largest boulders to where the waterfall cascaded down from a hidden spring 30 feet up the canyon wall, creating a curtain of silver water that had carved a shallow pool in the stone floor over countless centuries. To casual observation, there was nothing behind the falling water except solid rock, but Joseph's vision had shown him exactly where to look, and his hands moved with supernatural confidence as he began shifting the carefully arranged stones that concealed the entrance. "How did you know about this?" Dr. Henderson asked as he helped move a particularly heavy boulder that had been positioned to look like natural debris. Joseph paused in his work, considering how to explain what he had experienced without sounding like he had lost his mind. "Family knowledge," he said finally, which was both completely true and completely inadequate to describe the reality of what had happened. Behind the third stone they moved, a dark opening appeared in the canyon wall, a passage just large enough for a person to crawl through, angled upward into the darkness beyond. Cool air flowed from the opening, carrying scents of deep earth and ancient stone that spoke of vast spaces hidden within the canyon walls. "Incredible," Dr. Henderson whispered, playing his flashlight beam into the passage. "This is completely natural, carved by water over thousands of years. But how did you know it was here?" Instead of answering, Joseph helped Dr. Henderson create a makeshift stretcher from branches and spare rope, padding it with their jackets to cushion Maria during the journey through the narrow tunnel. The sound of rushing water was growing louder by the minute as the storm intensified above them, and Joseph could see debris beginning to tumble down from the canyon rim, loose stones and broken branches that warned of much worse to come. "Mama, I need you to stay awake and help us," Joseph said as they positioned her on the stretcher. "The passage is narrow, and we'll need to move slowly and carefully."
Maria nodded weakly, but Joseph could see determination in her eyes despite the pain she was obviously feeling.
"I trust you, son," she said simply. "Lead the way." The journey through the tunnel was a nightmare of cramped spaces and careful maneuvering, made worse by the need to drag an injured person through passages barely wide enough for a single person. Joseph led the way with Dr. Henderson's flashlight, following the route that had been burned into his memory during the vision, while the doctor pushed the stretcher from behind and monitored Maria's condition in the dim light. The tunnel wound upward through the canyon wall like the burrow of some enormous animal, occasionally opening into larger chambers, before narrowing again into passages that required them to crawl on hands and knees. But throughout the ordeal, Joseph never doubted the path. The knowledge given to him by his ancestors was as reliable as his own memories, perhaps more so. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they emerged into a chamber that took Joseph's breath away. The space was enormous, perhaps 40 feet across and 20 feet high, with a natural skylight that allowed filtered daylight to illuminate walls covered with the most extensive collection of ancient symbols Joseph had ever seen. But more immediately important was the sound of rushing water that echoed from far below. The flash flood had begun, and they could hear the creek that had been a gentle stream transformed into a raging torrent that would have swept away anyone caught on the canyon floor. "My God, Dr. Henderson said as he played his flashlight around the chamber. "This is remarkable. Look at these carvings, they cover every available surface. Joseph helped make Maria comfortable on a natural shelf that formed a perfect resting place, then joined Dr. Henderson in examining their surroundings. The chamber was clearly not just a natural formation. It had been modified and improved by human hands over many generations. Natural shelves had been carved deeper to create storage spaces, and what appeared to be a ventilation system of connected passages ensured that fresh air circulated throughout the space. This was a ceremonial chamber, Maria said weakly from her resting place. Look at the symbols above the entrance. Those are blessing marks, protection signs that would have been placed by shamans to sanctify the space. Joseph studied the intricate carvings that covered the walls from floor to ceiling, and gradually began to understand that they were looking at something far more significant than just ancient graffiti. This was a library, a repository of knowledge that represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about everything from astronomy and medicine to hunting techniques and weather prediction. Dr. Henderson, Joseph said slowly, I think we've stumbled onto one of the most important archaeological discoveries in California history. The physician nodded, his scientific training warring with the overwhelming reality of what they had found. These carvings appear to predate European contact by centuries, possibly longer. The preservation is incredible. Being sealed inside this chamber has protected them from weathering and vandalism. But as remarkable as the discovery was, Joseph found his attention drawn to a specific section of the wall where the carvings seemed newer, more detailed than the others. As he studied them more closely, he realized with growing amazement that they depicted events from the recent past, scenes that showed white settlers arriving in the area, conflicts between native peoples and newcomers, and what appeared to be prophecies about future events. Mama, come look at this, Joseph called softly. I think some of these symbols are about our own time. Maria struggled to sit up, leaning heavily on Joseph's arm as she examined the carvings he had indicated. Her face grew pale as she began to decipher the meanings hidden in the ancient symbols. These aren't just historical records, she said in a voice filled with wonder and alarm. They're predictions. Look here. This symbol represents a great conflict between peoples of different colors, and this one shows fire falling from the sky, destroying whole cities. Joseph felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air in the chamber. Are you saying these carvings predicted World War II? And more than that, Maria said, her voice growing stronger as her excitement overcame her pain. Look at this sequence here. It shows changes in the weather, great storms, and droughts that will test the survival skills of everyone who lives on the land. And here, symbols that represent new technologies that will change how people communicate across great distances. Dr. Henderson joined them in studying the prophetic carvings, his scientific skepticism battling with the increasingly undeniable evidence before his eyes. If these carvings are as old as they appear to be, he said carefully, then whoever created them possessed knowledge that defies our understanding of prehistoric capabilities. But Joseph was beginning to understand something that went beyond academic curiosity or archaeological significance. The chamber where they had taken shelter was more than just a safe haven from the flood. It was the heart of something his ancestors had created to help their descendants survive in a rapidly changing world. The vision quest, he said suddenly, remembering his great-great-grandmother's words about bridges between the physical and spirit worlds. This whole place was designed as a vision quest site, a location where people could come to receive guidance and knowledge from the ancestors. As if summoned by his words, the strange tingling sensation returned to Joseph's fingertips, and the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with gentle light. But this time, instead of being transported into a vision of the past, Joseph felt knowledge flowing directly into his consciousness. Practical information about weather patterns, healing techniques using local plants, and survival strategies that could help his family and community adapt to the challenges of the modern world. The storm is ending, Dr. Pear, Henderson announced, looking up toward the natural skylight where the sound of rain had diminished to a gentle patter. Joseph nodded, but his attention remained focused on the incredible repository of knowledge surrounding them. Dr. Henderson, would you be willing to help us document this place properly? The knowledge here could benefit everyone, not just native peoples. The physician's eyes were bright with excitement and professional interest. I'd be honored to help. This discovery needs to be shared with the academic world, but with proper respect for its cultural significance and your family's rights as its guardians. As they prepared to return to the surface world, Joseph carefully placed his hand one more time on the carved symbols that had started this entire adventure. The message he received was clear and unmistakable. The chamber would remain hidden and protected until the time came for its secrets to be revealed to a wider audience. But in the meantime, the Littlefield family had been chosen to serve as its guardians, ensuring that the ancient wisdom would not be lost or misused. The rope was still hanging down the canyon wall when they emerged from the chamber, and within an hour, a proper rescue operation had Maria safely on her way to the hospital in Laytonville. But as the family gathered that evening around the kitchen table in their small house, sharing the incredible story of the day's events, Joseph knew that their lives had been fundamentally changed by their experience in Bear Canyon. The ancient amulet that he had received during his vision lay on the table between them, its carved symbols seeming to capture and reflect the lamplight in ways that ordinary stone shouldn't be able to do. Maria's injuries would heal completely, but the knowledge she had gained about her heritage and her role as a keeper of memory would influence the rest of her life. Tommy sat wide-eyed as he listened to the story, occasionally touching the amulet with wonder and asking questions about the symbols and their meanings. Joseph could see the spark of curiosity and respect for their cultural heritage growing in his younger brother's eyes, and he knew that the responsibility for preserving and protecting the ancient knowledge would not rest on his shoulders alone. Henderson had kept his promise to document their discovery responsibly, working with Joseph and Maria to create detailed photographs and drawings of the most significant symbol sequences while respecting the family's wishes about what should and shouldn't be shared with the outside world. But perhaps most importantly, the experience had reunited the Littlefield family with a part of their heritage that had been dormant for generations. The ancient ways were not dead, merely sleeping, and Bear Canyon had awakened something in all of them that would continue to grow and develop in the years to come. As Joseph lay in bed that night, listening to the wind in the trees outside his window, he found himself thinking about the prophecies carved into the chamber walls and wondering what other challenges the future would bring to his people and his land. But for the first time in his life, he felt truly prepared to face whatever might come. The ancestors had spoken, and their descendants had listened. The bridge between ancient wisdom and modern survival had been rebuilt, and it would serve the Littlefield family well in all the years to come. In Bear Canyon, the hidden chamber waited patiently for the next time its secrets would be needed, protected by stone and time and the continuing vigilance of those who understood its true value. The circle was complete, but the story was far from over. It had only just begun.